Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the Open Source Citizenship Panel discussion as part of Upstream 2022. My name is Josh Simmons. I lead ecosystem strategy at Tidelift and former president of the Open Source Initiative, and am the current program chair for Upstream. In Edinburgh, while working at Google Open Source in 2018, I partnered with Kat Allman to convene a conversation on open source citizenship with the world's most respected leaders in both enterprise open source and in the rich nonprofit ecosystem of open source foundations. Some of these same panelists were there that day. We surveyed how companies were showing up for open source. We polled for the types of help foundation leadership felt were still needed. And we spoke frankly about the gaps that remained. Now, ever since, I've sought to regularly update that snapshot of open source citizenship at conferences around the world. And I'm honored to do it again here today at Upstream with today's esteemed panelists, with a view to how folks who are watching can cultivate a culture of open source citizenship at their own companies. Now, before we start today, let's meet our panelists. Briefly, each of you, who are you and what are your relationships to open source? Let's start with Deb.
Great. Hi, I'm Deb Nicholson. I'm the executive director of the Python Software Foundation. I've been working in free and open source software for about 15 years at a number of different nonprofit organizations. So thinking about sustainability and how we get people paid for what is often a labor of love is always top of mind for me. So I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you, Deb. How about you, Duane?
I'm Duane O'Brien. I'm the director of open source at Indeed.com. I've been leading the program office there for about 4.5 years now and have been involved in various ways in the open source sustainability conversation for a number of years. Before that, running PayPal's open source program office, the operations for that office, and regularly meet with a group of people who are involved in making funding decisions within their own organizations and figuring out how best to support open source projects that their organizations rely on. Thanks for having us here.
Thank you. Alyssa?
Hello, I'm Alyssa Wright. I help to lead the open source program office at Bloomberg. Prior to that, I do a lot of work in the open source sustainability space, keen eye towards having equitable and healthy and long live horizon open source projects. I'm particularly interested in our conversations around digital infrastructure and securing the supply chain. I have worked a lot in the open source startup and think tank space, and looking at models for how we can make open source sustainable for at all levels of kind of corporate development and size. And like Duane was saying, thank you so much for being here, for inviting us to be here today. It's exciting to talk about this.
Thank you so much for being here. How about Rob?
Hi, everyone. My name's Rob Underwood. I'm the global open source lead for Goldman Sachs. I joined Goldman about a year ago, and that's about the same length of time that we've had a formal open source program office within the bank. Previously, I was the chief development officer at Finos, the FinTech Open Source Foundation. And previous to that, I did a bit of a stint working on computer science education efforts, both in New York City and at the federal level. I was the CTO of a graduate school of education and did a 12.5-year stint in management consulting, first at KPMG and then at Deloitte.
Last and very much not least, Al.
Hey, thanks, Josh. So thanks to everybody for joining us today. Al Gillen, I'm a group vice president at IDC. IDC is a research firm where we look at IT technology topic areas really across the whole span, range from hardware to software to services and networking, telecom, things like that. My team at IDC is responsible for looking at development and deployment software. My own personal day job is focusing on open source software, and I've been doing that for about 20 years.
Thank you so much, Al. Thank you, all of you, again, for being here today. I think this is such an excellent group of and set of perspectives to bring to bear on the questions that we have before us. So let's spend a moment with the theme of Upstream. The theme for this year's Upstream is what we owe to each other. What does that mean to you in the context of open source? And let's start with reverse order. Let's go to you, Al.
You know, interesting thing about Upstream is that we find as we do our research that a lot of end user organizations think that upstream stuff just magically happens and somebody is taking care of that. The reality is that you know, development of any kind of technology, especially open source software, doesn't happen without contributions from a broad community. And one of the things that I think is still emerging, in fact, if anything, the panel we have here today is probably on the leading end or bleeding edge of this trend. But more and more organizations have to be focused on actually giving back to open source software and allowing that upstream community to be healthy. So you know, it's something that I think that the majority of organizations today are more in a position of using open source software, but not necessarily giving back to open source software in an upstream sense. The other thing I'll just add as an initial thought here is that you know, the security and the reliability of upstream componentry and or components or projects, I should say, is really becoming very important. I think that it's becoming more obvious to the world at large that, gee, we actually have to worry about this stuff, because if it breaks or if it's compromised, it affects a lot of organizations, potentially including my own.
Rob.
Yeah, so thanks, Josh. So like any large enterprise nowadays, or I would say almost any large enterprise, we run our tech stack on tens of thousands of open source projects and libraries, especially when you take into consideration transitive dependencies. You know, we think the right way to work is that our engineers are enabled to be able to contribute back and patch and add features to the projects that we consume. So, you know, for us, a real focus is on, you know, looking at those packages that we consume and that we rely on most heavily, and then putting ourselves in a position where we can authentically contribute back and also be part of the wider community, including participate in standards committees, working groups, the various activities that happen across the different foundations. And so it's about contributing back and earning a seat at the table to provide input to the collaborative shared roadmaps of open source projects that are earned through code contribution. And so we want to make sure that we're allowing our engineers and providing them the developer experience and ergonomics so that they can contribute back and contribute to upstream repos.
Yeah, I'd like to second that. Can't remember if I'm in the right order, but I think authentically giving back, like sometimes that, and maybe the baseline is a certain amount of financial contribution, but I think much more interesting conversation and more authentic conversation when we think about the, you know, these communities that are making the technologies and the projects that are part of the supply chain, is how do we contribute back in a way that is just as valuable and maybe more, you know, sustainable, that goes beyond money. So being part of governance boards, I think you had listed, Robert, being part of like collaborative shared roadmaps, you know, earning a seat at a table, so that it's not just about like code contribution or you've paid your way, paid to play, but that you're, authentically being part of a community's like long-term success and health. So, and that's not just with money. So I think we all acknowledge here that money is important. So, but it is a baseline.
Absolutely. I appreciate you highlighting that. And that is something we're going to come back to as well. Duane, and then we'll wrap up with that.
Sure. When you first floated this as a potential theme, I started thinking about it, and there's really two facets of this theme that I think I want to challenge people who are here, people who are watching, people who are listening to think about. And one of them is, for your own organization, figuring out what is reasonable to set as a target for you to give back to the open source community, and how you're approaching that, and what your framework is for deciding what's fair. We know what unfair looks like, or we know what maybe bad citizenry looks like. But when you try to step to good citizenry, like how do you know what's appropriate? How do you decide what's appropriate? And do you have a decision-making framework? Are you picking a number out of the air, right? So whether you approach it by setting aside portions of revenue or per developer seat licensing sort of frames of thinking for what you want to give back, that's a hard problem, and you're going to have to wrestle with it. Like, nobody here is going to have an answer for the magic number. The second aspect I want to challenge us to think about is that if we frame this as what we owe to each other, I think we're selling the entire problem and ourselves short, because we are all in the organizations that we're in for a very limited amount of time. And everyone in this industry, they move around a lot. So what we owe to each other today means something completely different in 2 years, because all the seats have changed. We need to think about this also as what we owe to ourselves, because if we want the ecosystem of open source to be healthy and there for us long term, that is as much about making sure that we are taking care of ourselves as much as taking care of each other.
Yeah, I would love to sort of build on that idea of thinking of like, it is nice to have metrics on how much your company should be doing and how much you owe to this ecosystem. But I think it's worth thinking about how people are individuals. And if you are lucky enough to have someone who is embedded in a community, a technical community that's really important to you, then you sort of have to let them lead. They might say, hey, I signed up for this working group or this committee. It's going to be like 2 or 3 hours a week for a year, but it's our turn, and it's my turn as an individual in the community to take on this extra responsibility. And I think, and then it might not feel like, oh, it doesn't feel like our turn, but you have to let the individual who's in that community lead and tell you. I would also say that, again, focusing on that these are individuals like participating in communities that sometimes when you send folks to these seats at the table that you have paid for through like sweat or cash, they have to be able to like sometimes leave the hat of being there for your company at the door and participate as a member of the community. And when they are struggling with that, like, I encourage people to, to say, hey, like Rob did, like, there are some things I can't talk about, or there are some things I can't do, or some things we can't sign off on. I'm not going to stop the conversation, but I want to highlight that I'm being quiet for this part now. And so I think we owe each other that honesty of when they're saying, like, personally, I'd really love to see this particular library because it would make my personal work really easy. And then sometimes say, yeah, I do hate the tabs, but it is the best for everyone else who's not me. So let's do it. Whatever that thing is, it might be much bigger than the tabs. And so, yeah, I think we owe each other like a good description of when we're acting as individuals, when we're acting in the interest of the community, and when we're, you know, on a mission for our employers.
Yeah, thank you all for that. There's something underlying the theme that perhaps is worth signposting for those who are watching. Is likely very familiar for those here on the panel with me. You know, in open source, we have systemic resource disparities. You know, you look at any given company, and that company, whether they know it or not, is relying probably on 70%. 70% of their stack is probably open source. And so the modern organization has an existential relationship with open source. It depends on it. And yet we have this entrenched resource disparity because of the way that open source has worked. You know, there's not only the resource disparity in terms of money, but also just pure time, right? As we grow, we have a growing awareness of the challenges of under-resourced projects. We see that not only are we concerned about whether projects remain maintained and get regular, you know, bug fixes, but also we want to make sure that they're meeting new standards as we learn what best practices are for security and supply chain health. We want to help these maintainers do more to nurture a productive and healthy and welcoming community as well. And I highlight not just the resource disparity, but also the sort of skill disparity that there might be, because the vast majority of open source projects are maintained by a single person. And no one person can ever contain all of the skills necessary to really lead a thriving project that one can be confident is not just here today and tomorrow, but 10 years from now. And so the reason we're having this discussion about what do we owe each other and what does it mean to be an open source citizen is because what we have done to date is what got us into trouble in the first place. And so there's one follow-up here that I would love to dig into. Duane, you pushed back a little bit on this this notion of what do we owe to each other and what do we owe to ourselves. I wonder, we have a habit, royal we, societal we have a habit of individualizing responsibility for systemic issues. You look at recycling. You look at charity, particularly in the United States, and the way that people use nonprofits to make up for gaps in government services. There's this way that the solution often is proposed as what can I do as an individual to help ameliorate this issue? What I'm wondering, Duane, from your perspective, as you've been so intimately involved with these sustainability conversations, how do you see us needing to show up sort of as collectives, as organizations in new ways?
There's two things I guess I would say. And the first is that there's no shortcut for getting your hands dirty, right? Like we might want there to be one. There are plenty of business models around removing complexity and making it easy. This was one of Tidelift's early sort of trumpet calls for the business model. Like, we will help you figure out how to sustain your dependencies by negotiating these relationships with lifters and so on. And removing that complexity is easy because it means that an organization can just sign a check and make the guilt of the problem go away. It doesn't actually make the problem go away. It just addresses how somebody in the organization feels about it. If you really want to show up, you have to roll up your sleeves and like dig into your dependency usage, figure out what's being used where, how important it is, how healthy it is, and what levers you have within your own organization that you can throw to encourage people and get them involved in these conversations. I think a lot of the dependencies that sort of fall into unmaintained status, it's because the work that's left to do isn't fun. Right? Like It's one of the reasons why we keep rewriting the same half dozen different libraries every couple of years, because making the new thing is fun, but like getting the old thing working is less fun. Organizations, I think, have a unique set of levers that they can throw to help people do the janitorial work in open source dependencies that isn't fun. And lastly, the more we talk to each other about the work that we're doing within our organizations, I think the more effectively we can show up as a collective. If we're all making these decisions in isolation, we're all going to kind of keep arriving at the same conclusions and maybe not getting the most out of our work.
Josh, can I just touch on something that Duane brought up?
Please.
I think he really brought a really important point, is that there's these different phases that open source software projects go through, right? They start out as a new idea. It's very exciting. Everybody wants to get involved. And over time, the technology gets established, and then the details and the improvements become more and more technology or technical in nature. And over time, the people that they maybe initially got this project going or were early contributors probably will move on to the next exciting project. And somebody's left behind to carry the project forward. And if we don't have a plan and a process for maintaining these projects, we wind up with essentially old projects that nobody is paying attention to, which is potentially catastrophic for open source software. And that's something we can't afford to have happen in the industry.
I just wanted to say that I think one of the things that we've come a long way on recognizing that administrative work and like accounting work and payroll work, like all of those fundraising, like all these things that people who are working on exciting new code don't want to do, like we've come a long way on those things, but some of the stuff we still have not come as far as I think we could on is really teaching people how to delegate and mentor new people. Like if you are bored with this now, in a year, you're going to leave it totally undocumented and unmaintained. So let's talk before you're bored with it and teach you how to delegate that, document it, and it might, I think one of the stumbling blocks is that people they're looking for like a version of themselves that doesn't have their own project to work on. And instead they need to be looking for probably like 4 newer people that want to take on a quarter of the work that they are not going to want to do in a year or 2. But we don't have a good language about teaching that delegation and that passing the torch and, giving power to the next group of people to come along so that you can go off and work on the new thing and leave it behind.
I'd like to second that, and I love this term, the language of delegation. I mean, and my mom always says, like, the best leadership is the type of leadership you can walk away from, and it continues to thrive. And I'm not sure that we have an ethos of open source success, on the human scale of the goal should be we want you to walk away and have the project survive, and grow far beyond you. So the language of delegation, I'm still learning it every day of my life, I feel like, but I think that there is, and to your point, Deb, also that there is much around this like janitorial work that we have grown a lot to respect and appreciate when it comes to open source communities. But the this janitorial work of keeping a project alive, past one's excitement has faded. I think there's a lot for us to learn and to grow there. One thing to go back also to what Duane was saying, that I don't necessarily disagree with, but it definitely made me listen a bit more, is about you gotta get your hands dirty. And I definitely think it's important to know as much as one can about the open source projects that you and the communities that you are responsible for, but how deep can you really go? And is that what we need to ask everybody to be who's involved in this conversation to get into. I think there are tools, there are partners that we can find trust in, that can help bring us, that can, obfuscate some of that mess so that we can still make good, smart, and authentically and kind decisions to one another.
I would just add too that I think there's some connective tissue here between the discussion we're having around open source contribution and then some of the discussion I think that's been touched on around open source security. And then I'm sure we'll probably have some discussion about some of the recent things that have popped up. Where I think these things start to bump up against each other is I think we would generally accept the hypothesis that if a project starts off with 5 maintainers that are roughly able to review 5 pull requests per day, I'm just sort of making these numbers up, and then you start to see that 5 maintainers becomes 3 maintainers, and one of those maintainers, she's taken a full-time job and she's not really working on maintainer work anymore, and now they can only review 1 pull request per day. That could be a leading indicator potentially that the observability and I guess is that the right? Yeah, I guess the certainly the capacity to monitor and remediate bugs has probably lessened to some degree. So I think where rather than making open source security only a matter of waiting for vulnerabilities to appear and then remediating them, I think part of where a lot of folks are thinking now is how do we start to use some anticipatory capabilities and capacities to say, hey, this project looks like it is in trouble and they need more resources, they need more labor, they need more financial resources, they need help. And us as a community putting in those remediations early and often, such that projects don't get to a point where effectively they're underwater with a major vulnerability and everyone's spending the holidays digging out of that. So I think starting to look at that together, and then I think for large enterprises, that's going to mean really understanding what are the projects that are most important to us, which is probably going to be a heuristic for that is probably going to be the ones that we use the most, and then looking at those and sort of looking at the project activity, the contribution activity, the commitment of the maintainers itself as a way to evaluate overall project health, and then assess, okay, so this is a project that we rely a lot on, and it looks like one of their maintainers has left and that has some implications. How can we help? And then I think that's a question that we can all ask is how can we help? How can we pitch in and help? What can we do as individuals and as organizations when we see a project, especially a project that we all rely on, or most of us rely on? And I think we can think of a few examples of those that we want to get involved with.
I really appreciate where we've gone with this discussion here, and there are a few things I'd like to highlight before moving on. For anybody who is watching this, I don't know if you've noticed the pattern, but there is a prerequisite. There's a prerequisite to making a difference here, and that's just knowing what your dependencies are in the first place. If you don't know what your dependencies are, you don't know where to direct your support. So if you're at a company that doesn't have a good record of what open source you're relying on, that's step one, frankly. There's something else in this discussion that I really want to underscore, which is, Rob, I thought you put a really fine point on it, that we need to think about what does it mean to proactively mitigate these things? What does it mean to create healthy projects and project communities such that those sort of once in a blue moon, increasingly not devastating bugs become less frequent, right? And so I think there are a few things in there. There's, what do we do to identify those communities in need? What do we do to resource them and lift them up? I do love and hear this point that, hey, we got to roll up our sleeves. Yeah, money is one resource that absolutely we should be directing to these communities, but money is not the end all be all. In fact, many communities don't know how to receive money or don't know how to make decisions to use the money. And that's another layer altogether. There's one more thing in here, and this I think came from Duane, and then Alyssa really drove this home. In open source, in the world of maintainers, I think we have perhaps more salient examples of what we often describe as benevolent dictators for life, BDFLs, a term that I really hope goes out of fashion soon. We have more salient examples of people who are like, I lead this project for life, and when that changes, who knows? We have more of those examples than we do of maintainers who have very deliberately taken their community through a process of succession planning and evolution such that they could walk away. And I think the fact that I can only name a few maintainers who I know who have done that, as compared to the probably dozen I could name who are who held control of their projects for arguably longer than they ought to have, that suggests to me that there is something to be done in terms of helping maintainers lead that way, in terms of uplifting those who do and telling those stories so that we have more of those as role models to look to. Now, that said, I don't want to spend too much time on what maintainers should do, because this is what we should do to uplift maintainers. So before, we have just a couple more questions that I think will probably take us all the way to the end here. And I want to make sure that we ultimately start talking about some of the things that we see happening in the industry, that we see promise in, that we think people should start paying attention to or getting involved with. But before we get to that point, I realize we have sort of skipped to analysis and exploration and what can we do to improve things. But maybe it would be useful if we enumerated a few of the ways things have just gone wrong. I often think about Heartbleed in 2014 as the big event that rattled our cages and got us thinking more deeply. Yes, there were people who were thinking about this deeply before the rest of us, but that's the thing that really woke us all up. But it's just one example in a vast ecosystem. And so I'm wondering if anybody here has experiences with particular projects or certain things you've seen in the news recently that to you fit this pattern of projects that maybe went through some pain, but maybe didn't need to if we had been there for them in the first place. What are some of the projects, the stories, or even the consequences we feel as their downstream users when those projects are not necessarily supported well? Now, I will not round robin this one. I'll just invite people to speak up if they have something that's come to mind.
I would say it isn't necessarily always newsworthy, but I do think that for small projects, when a lawsuit happens, they end up having to put literally everything else on hold and figure out how to fundraise for that. The one I'm thinking of is the GNOME project with the patent suit, and they turned that into an amazing success story. But I get email from GNOME and I see them on like different social media stuff, and it ate up a ton of their time. And they're a very small organization, like 4 or 5 staff people. And so that, to me, like looking at that kind of thing, it's software can be pretty litigious. A lot of companies are out there driving value on monopolies on intellectual property, and that leaves a lot of our nonprofit, understaffed projects like very vulnerable to having to just tear up their to-do list for the year and fundraise. So I mean, I would love to see something more in common for that. I know a lot of companies have lawyers, like encouraging the lawyers who work on these issues, like around licensing and trademark and patent stuff, to say like, hey, if these are the 7 projects, if they ever encounter a lawsuit, like, just tell us how much pro bono time they need and you can go do it. Like, I mean, that's in a perfect world. So I'll just put that out there as the gold bar. Other folks might be able to speak a little bit more to security. I feel like we have talked about that a bunch, but maybe there's new vectors that we should be looking at that from.
Just a thought on my end is when I think of a healthy open source software project, I think of it as really having a multitude of components, including there's a volunteer community who probably created the project and got it off the ground and got it to a first level of viability. But truthfully, I think of a healthy community as also potentially having a commercial component of some sort, whether it's a company that takes the software and commercializes it and makes it available as a subscription-based product, which, there's people that look at that and say, well, that's not really fair to the developers that they created the project. And there's some truth to that. But at the same time, that establishes an ongoing commitment to that software, which is going to last for as long as the product is of interest to commercial users. The other piece of it I think that's important is, and unfortunately, it doesn't apply to every single project, but having the engagement of a larger foundation. So Apache Foundation, Linux Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, organizations like that bring some of the management and process to those projects that, frankly, the developers that created the project initially and are maintaining it probably don't have those skills and maybe not even the interest in doing that sort of administrative work. So there's an argument that says that those components are really valuable additions to make a project be successful for the long term.
I'm so glad you. Can I jump in on this one, Alyssa? Is that all right?
Yeah, of course.
Right. I'm so glad you tagged in on foundations, Al, because it's one of the places where I feel like we've collectively let ourselves in the industry down, and maybe it's a little broad, but if you think about the model we have now, where large projects develop a dependence on cloud computing credits from private organizations because there is no viable public option for them, right? How we got here is a failure of us collectively, right? Like, we should not have to go begging to Microsoft or Amazon or Google or DigitalOcean for cloud computing credits for our projects, right? There should be a publicly funded option for them that just doesn't exist because we didn't fill this gap. We've allowed the private sector to consume it.
I really appreciate. Excuse me, Alyssa. I thought please take it away.
And this might be I think, foundational starting point, but something that I have found really exciting around this conversation around security is that there continues to be a handful of projects, vulnerabilities where things seem to break down for a moment, some more significant than others, and we all scurry, and we scurry internally, and I think we scurry externally about how to manage, I think, secure like risk. And I think it's kind of an exciting time to be involved in that conversation, because this hasn't been figured out. It probably will never in a way be figured out. But it's a place of a lot of need, I think, right now, and it's sort of like we're being asked by these security threats or risks to like clean out our house a bit more before we continue to have like, you know, the rager in the backyard. So you had asked like, you know, what has been going on that's like, you know, potentially has opened up a lot of like opportunity and positive, at least that's how I wrote the question, like, you know, positive development. I think in many respects it's a kind of a positive time for the conversation around like securing our open source projects because a lot is going on and it's hard to keep track. But at least some of the language is consistent. So we don't have to get lost in the language. We can at least get lost in the solutions. So.
Thank you, Alyssa. I really appreciate where this conversation has gone, and in particular, Deb, thank you for highlighting a risk vector that probably isn't top of mind for a lot of people, which is just legal threats. And the way foundations have sort of risen to the fore in this conversation, I think is not an accident. It seems to me like the foundation's ecosystem probably has a pretty significant role to play in helping to create a more healthier open source ecosystem for everybody. You know, for folks who may not be terribly familiar with open source foundations, these are organizations that are various flavors of nonprofit that provide a home for open source projects, a home that is a neutral territory that isn't beholden to any one vendor. And critically, foundations will provide some of that back office support and, among other things, for projects: access to a bank account, accounts receivable, accounts payable, legal counsel. You know, some foundations are opinionated about governance and how a project manages itself. And that adds another layer of rigor and support for the maintainers and community around that project. And I want to highlight that last part, that sort of governance side of things, because that, to me, there's a connectivity to the previous part of our conversation where we talk about succession planning, right? How do we get projects to be bigger than any one individual, bigger than the maintainer who created it in the first place? And that's one of the problems that we have to solve for. Now, we only have a little bit of time left with us. Before I jump to the next thing, Alyssa, what's on your mind?
I just also want to say that like foundations are very important. Like, I am a huge fan, but they are not all the same. And so we should just, they also have their own you know, goals as well. So
I really appreciate you highlighting that. It is, not all foundations are alike. In fact, there's quite a variety, and it is really worth looking at each one and what they offer, what their motivations are, and what their track record is in terms of supporting the projects that that call them home. I think that's a really good point. I think in particular, things that call themselves nonprofit often avoid scrutiny, at least avoid public scrutiny. And so it really is worth not taking that for granted and looking at them you know, pretty closely. See a couple other
Josh, could I just, if I know we're on the topic of foundations, and this is maybe a little bit of a kind of a side note, but I wanted to at least mention it. You know, as to the foundations, and I used to work at one. This is going to sound very operational, but I would just use this opportunity to say, if there's one thing that the foundation ecosystem could do collaboratively, and I would also include corporate entities that host open source projects at scale could do, it's to define a common standard and process for contributor license agreements. If you really want to unlock dozens and hundreds of developers being able to contribute from large organizations, define a common standard and protocol for contributor license agreement onboarding. It takes, it is an extremely manual, labor-intensive process to onboard just a single developer to the 3 or 4 or 5 CCLAs, ICLAs, maybe for another project, it's the the DCO instructions. I think large organizations like ourselves would love to be able to integrate with APIs so that we could basically push a button that onboards a new developer so that they're approved to contribute on our behalf and gets her, him, they set up in all of the requisite CCLA Schedule A's or provide some instructions on ICLAs. But I don't know that the foundations have had a lot of opportunities to talk with each other about how to build a common framework so that, when we bring somebody on board to contribute on behalf of our firm, we might need to get them on 2 or 3 CCLAs at least. And, having to do all this email and this back and forth and manual tracking, it really is a big area of improvement. It might seem super in the weeds and super operational, but if you want to unlock a lot of contribution activity, focus on the CCLAs and simplifying that.
We
Rob,
just automated that on GitHub. Like we just implemented a CLA bot. So literally everybody who comes to their repo on GitHub is asked to sign the same thing. Yeah, but I hear you on the making it easy. I would say even like the CLA is just the beginning. Like it's worth going through for projects that want people to contribute to have like a page that says, so you want to contribute, and has all of the guidelines for like code style, what the general process is at that particular project, like how many times you should expect to have your patch reviewed and by who and how long it's going to take, because people come like really enthusiastic, and if you don't tell them it takes a year and 15 people to review a patch, they're going to be gone by the time you finish. I hope it doesn't take that long at your project. You should consider figuring that out also, but whatever the process is, like people need to know what it is so that they know that they're in the pocket, they're heading towards their patch being accepted or their thing being put into the upstream.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in here because we're running low on time, and I want to get to our final question. But I really appreciate this this part of the conversation, and I want to underline something that I think is sort of shared between Rob and Deb. What you're sharing there is there's a need to, on the one hand, Deb, to your point, set expectations clearly so people don't self-select out of a process when they're making good progress on it. And to the point that both of you have made there, as much as we can do to reduce friction, to make doing the right thing easier, is something that can pay dividends for all of us. Now, we have just about 5 minutes left here, and I want to hear from everybody. So in closing, for folks who are tuned in, what is one area, one project, one initiative, one thing that you see a lot of promise in that you would encourage folks to start paying attention to or get involved in? And I'm going to go ahead and start with Duane.
Had a feeling that you would do that. I guess I'll start with the framework that we've been using and sharing because we've seen it adopted in other organizations. We've been running with a framework called the FOSS Contributor Fund now for I guess we're just started our 4th year now, which is super exciting, where we have a budget set aside specifically to fund open source projects and to fund open source people. It requires a lot of work on our end to make sure we understand what we're using where and who are the people who are doing work that we want to support. Most recently, Spotify dropped a blog post where they talked about doing their own FOSS fund at Spotify. It's been adopted at Salesforce and Johns Hopkins University and Microsoft, and we wrote a report about it last year as well. And there's several people that I talk with on a regular basis who are taking similar kinds of approaches. Sentry is another one that did one in October. There's some momentum around organizations setting aside some budget for the purpose of sustaining open source. Pay attention to that conversation, get involved in it, and look for a way to start yourself.
And can I follow up on that? 100% everything Duane just said. But what I think is interesting about how the conversation has been evolving is what can we do beyond like writing a check? So these are projects that we've identified that we want to continue to support, and they're meaningful and critical, long term. It is relatively easy for us to write a check at this point. Like what else is there to do? And I feel like that what else, that standing on that precipice and the evolution of what a FOSS, like contributor fund, might look like when we get to a place of that what else is a really exciting, I think, for us to structure and codify.
Thank you, Duane and Alyssa. Deb, how about you?
I have another thing that I'm excited about.
Please have that.
I'm really excited about something that we've been doing on the to-do group, which is about providing guidance to corporate contributors on how to be authentic open source citizen. I think that employees of companies often they want to collaborate, they want to be part of the community, and we don't necessarily, collaboration, particularly in open source, is not always like easy. And so there are things that many of us have learned over the years. There are mistakes that I think we need to find like space and support to allow, but having kind of the guidance on like the social framework of being a good open source, an authentic open source contributor, citizen, is something that I'm really excited about. And so the to-do group is working on putting together a short guide directed for developers. This might be like more extensive, or I imagine made specialized for an individual company. And we'll be presenting kind of a panel discussion about where that comes from, what that might mean at the upcoming ASPOCon North America in Austin. Check it out.
Awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. I'll throw to Deb.
Yeah, I'll just try and keep it short. I would say for companies that already get it, and we're talking about how to navigate the social, that is awesome. But if you're just getting started, get in touch earlier rather than later. Don't spend a lot of time on a bunch of patches and libraries and things that you are applying privately, release after release after release. The sooner you get in touch, and the more time you will save yourself, especially if you're using something like Python. There are like 7 other companies that probably want to see the same improvement that you do. Don't go it alone. Get in touch.
Elle.
So I guess I know we're running short on time, Josh. My one thought is that I don't think there's enough awareness at the executive level of companies on the dependence that organizations have on open source software, and the importance that open source software has to their underlying business. And I kind of look back, this has always been a problem. If you go back to the early 2000s, the CIOs would say, we're not using open source software, and the admins were saying, we're using Linux, right? And it's really the case today where we ask, are developers using open source components? Yes, they are. They're using open source developer tools. Yes, they are. But again, the awareness of just how much dependency there is out of sync with what the executive perceptions are.
Absolutely. And Rob.
Josh, can you restate the question? What's the question that you're looking for an answer on?
Absolutely. So, for those who are watching, what is an area where you see promise that folks should either pay attention to or get involved in?
an area that shows promise that people should get involved in. Well, I guess it's a little bit of a generic area, but I do think that, and I guess it's, I'm talking our book a little bit, but I would say that there's a lot of activity happening in financial services around open source, and more so than maybe people know or are aware. And I would say especially on the buy side, the asset management side, there are some organizations that are doing tremendous amount of work on being active open source contributors and maintainers and stewards. But also on the sell side, I think there's a lot of wonderful projects that are emerging from that ecosystem as well. So I would say, watch this space. There's a lot of good projects coming forth, and yeah. So I would say, watch this space in financial services.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Folks, you heard it here. Watch this space because a lot's happening. Start speaking and developing in the open as soon as you possibly can. You'll save yourself some trouble and everybody else. FOSS funds are a great way to raise awareness of open source dependencies within your company and direct funds to those projects that you depend on. Learn to be an authentic contributor. It takes some skill and finesse. And then just broadly raise awareness, because the awareness may not exist at the executive level in many companies. And I'll just add one more thing myself. If you are writing checks, if you are engaging in the foundation's ecosystem, look for the foundations that don't already have like treasure chests that are bursting at the seams, because there is a broad ecosystem of foundations, and I cannot emphasize that enough. And every foundation needs our support because every foundation is hosting critical projects. Folks, Al, Alyssa, Deb, Duane, Rob, thank you all so much for your time today. Really appreciate your thoughts and your expertise. Hopefully by the time we convene for Upstream 2023, our conversation will have evolved a little bit further. Thank you for joining us.